There's a lot of invisible problems that societies face that are particularly hard to solve because no one can see them. So, if you think about even the Greeks, who were one of the most revolutionary civilizations on earth, who invented democracy and basically laid the foundation for modern science, philosophy, and all kinds of other subjects, and were huge innovators in theater. They still believed that women were inferior to men and that slavery was natural, in fact, and was good for slaves. In fact, Aristotle wrote that some people were born to be masters and other people were born to be living tools. And that's one of the most enlightened philosophers of the day. So we constantly overlook these problems because we can't see them. And I think that bell curve, that wide difference between the top and the bottom, the fact we've accepted as natural, is the biggest invisible problem facing our society now. Mm-hmm. So a year later, using the JUMP program, after using the JUMP program, the teacher retested her kids, and on average they were in the 98th percentile with the lowest in the 95th. Mm-hmm. And a year later they all signed up for the Pythagoras math competition, and 14 of the 17 got awards of distinction. So, and the other 3 came close. So that, it looked like a very strong, almost gifted class by that point, 2 years later. And I think that can happen not only in math, but it could happen in the arts. I've seen similar changes in kids taught creative writing well. And I don't think, I think one of the reasons we struggle in theater, why theater struggles to find audiences now, and is because we have a population that's not really been educated according to their full potential, and that many people start to lose their sense of curiosity, or their sense of wonder, their sense of engagement, empathy, all those things, I think, through repeated challenges, kids are born with this infinite sense of curiosity and wonder, and over they're told they can't do certain things that are important to adults, and that's their experience through school. So they're lucky to survive believing they have one talent or one interest by the end of high school. Mm-hmm. And I think we'll never have a flourishing theater or artistic community until we start to address those problems.
So maybe one of the other invisible problems that you're talking about is this idea that one either has talent in the arts or talent mm-hmm. in sciences and math and technology, but can't be gifted in both of those areas.
Yeah, it's as if you're using one half of your brain, you have to leave the other half empty for storage. I don't know where that idea. Right. We're just an incredibly inertial society. If less than 50 years ago, people thought women couldn't do mathematics. We had slaves less than 100 years ago, and we see differences between people, or people things can't do, and we assume they're just genetic or natural or inborn. And we still haven't really gotten very far beyond that. Otherwise, people would really be protesting the state of education now. They would recognize it's probably the most serious issue facing us. Mm-hmm. I hope one day we'll look back on this as a kind of dark age, that we'll actually recognize how little we did to educate children.
That's frightening.
Mm-hmm. We've made a lot of progress. We've made enormous progress on every front, but we really haven't even begun to tap into a fraction of the potential that children have, not just for academic success, but for joy, a sense of wonder, a sense of self-efficacy and motivation, all those things.
But there's lots of reasons why we hold on to that. It serves many interests. It's not that we're just unenlightened. It actually serves the labor market. It serves lots of interests.
Yeah, that's a really difficult issue. It certainly produces lots of people who will accept low wages and will work in very terrible conditions. But in the long run, it doesn't really service our economy at all, if you take a wider view, because we'd have a much more productive economy with a well-educated population. Mm-hmm. We'd also have I think there's even deeper losses that come from failing to educate people well. We think if our government put walls around our national parks and said only certain people can come in here, only certain people have the talent to come in here and appreciate this beauty, we think that was insane, but that's what we've done in the art, in both the arts and the sciences. Like, for instance, we think it's natural for the vast majority of kids to graduate from high school thinking there's no, I mean, we'd think they were stunted if they didn't see any beauty in the visible world, in a mountain or a star, but we think it's natural for them to see no beauty in the invisible world. The incredible patterns and connections that extend through time and space and that connect everything in the universe. We think it's natural that they have no appreciation of the absolutely awe-inspiring elegance of the universe. Whether you believe there's a creator or not, somehow it constantly outstrips our imagination. We think it's natural for them to have no sense of that. So there's a loss there. We also have a society, we had a financial crisis because people can't really, don't understand risk or what's going to happen if their mortgage goes up. If your mortgage, if you're getting a mortgage of 3% and it goes up to, well, let's say, I'll use an easy number. Suppose you got a mortgage of 1% and it goes up to 1.5%. That's only a 0.5% increase, but it's actually 50% increase of your mortgage rate. People don't have any sense of that, which is one of the reasons we had a financial crisis. And they don't know how to add up the consequences of their actions. I mean, we're in great danger with global warming. It's probably one of the greatest threats to humanity, especially to the developing world, who will suffer inordinately and disproportionately. And we cannot take any action because we have no clue how our actions add up. So it's a serious problem on every front.
So I know that you've talked about this before, but I think the idea of talent in the arts or in any area and the idea of giftedness in education are at odds a little bit with this utopia that you're imagining if we were a better educated collective. And so how do you, in your own work, how do you think about those ideas that are very ubiquitous and I presume problematic in your view of things?
Yeah, there's research that shows as early as kindergarten, kids start to compare themselves and decide who's talented and who's not in any given subject. And we allow those comparisons to persist because we think they're natural and innocent. But what if every kid could do well in any subject? The kids who decide they're not in the talented groups, their brains stop working efficiently. They stop engaging, taking risks, listening, and they get more and more anxious as they fail. So, I think the hierarchies produce themselves, our belief. That's not to say every kid will be the same, but we could raise the standard in every subject that kids could decide to go into any subject, could experience the wonder of any subject. And I think that, I think if I've never had a natural bent for anything, which is maybe why I feel so strongly. I took calculus at University of Toronto years ago, my first time, and almost failed. I was saved by the bell curve. And I got the lowest mark in my creative writing class. So. And
now you're speaking against the bell curve? What's wrong?
Yeah. So, in theater, I never felt I had a gift for theater. It took me years. What changed my life was reading Sylvia Plath's letters to her mother when I was around 21. And it was clear from the letters that she taught herself to be a writer by sheer determination. She set out as a teenager to become a poet. She read everything she could about poetry. She memorized poems. She did something we'd never tell young writers to do now. She wrote imitations of the poems she loved. And you could see her early poems are very derivative, but gradually, as she developed her craft, she began to capture her experience. And that was a revelation to me at age 21 that I could actually follow a path to develop a talent for something. Because until then, I thought you just had to be born with a gift. So I started imitating her poems and other poets, and then by a series of accidents ended up in theater. But I think that there's only two things that have kept me going in theater. One is I think I've been lucky enough to maintain the sense of wonder I had as a child that came partially from reading science fiction, and that's what gave me a sense that math was a potentially magical subject. And this idea that if you persevered, you could learn something. And maybe a third thing is that I recognized very early that I would only be able to write if I used a lot of found material. So I would copy down conversations I heard or things I'd read in journals or articles, and then try and place those things next to each other and see what would happen in the space between. And I think that gradually developed some skill as a kind of editor of the things I was hearing and seeing. So I think for young writers, that's something I think they don't know they can draw on, is that the world is constantly producing things that will surpass your imagination and are often more rich and interesting than anything you could create sitting in front of a blank piece of paper. And so you can draw on that.
So be attuned to the world.
Yeah, I think so.
Perceive the world.
Yeah.
You in your writing and thinking, you talk a lot about this idea of practice.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you have quite specific ideas about how you practice, other than in that sort of drilled, monotonous way that many of us have had
Right.
in math education.
Right.
And I was wondering, what does that practice look like in theater? What does that practice look like in the arts? But I think you're addressing that somewhat.
Yeah, it started off very mechanical, of trying to figure out how a writer would write. And I mean, I remember reading once that Hemingway set out to write one good sentence a day at one point in his career. So I used to try and write one good sentence, or try and write a line like some other writer. And gradually realized I could use my own experience. And I mean, I remember in New York once I heard someone in the street, a woman yelling, in the middle of a fight, a woman yelled at her boyfriend, "You just don't know what you don't want." I thought that was a great line, a great double negative. So that's when I began to realize that all I had to do was listen.
Right. That reminds me of when I first read Kenneth Branagh's autobiography, and he's often asked, how do you become a great actor? And I remember this line. He said, you want to be a great actor, go to the gallery and look at great art. You know, his answer was, perceive the world. That's what it's about. Open yourself up to all kinds of experiences and different kinds of arts.
And then the other thing I think, I mean, I realized as a mathematician and playwright that there is a lot of similarity between what I do in both areas. Because in both areas you're looking for patterns and connections and resonances, analogies. You're constantly just looking for patterns. And I think that I was inspired by writers like Beckett or Chekhov, who were just amazing at finding a formal structure for their plays that would allow all the things they experienced to fall into place. So I first started to understand that in theater when in the 80s, I think I read that apparently people didn't call each other long distance very often in the 70s, or enough from the point of view of Bell. And so that's why Bell started its Reach Out and Touch Someone campaign, to really tell people they needed to connect with their families in distant places. There was one of my first plays, Scientific American, there was the psychologist working for the military talking about that they had started the Reach Out and Touch Someone campaign, and then that was juxtaposed with a son calling her mother, and he hadn't called his mother in a long time. So I realized you could have ideas that would float above the action and sort of frame the action, and then all the mundane things that are happening in people's everyday life would be juxtaposed against those ideas. So that's when I started realizing the formal structure of the play was really important to me. And I think it really came to a head with plays like Half-Life. My mother was in a nursing home for quite a while, and had a stroke and couldn't feed herself, and so she needed to be in the home. And so I spent a lot of hours waiting there, and that was really, and had the experience often of interruption or conversations being interrupted. And I remembered being at a party once and telling a story, and someone had come up and interrupted the story. And when the person went away, I don't know, I decided I wouldn't continue telling the story. And the person I was talking to completely forgot that I was telling a story, even though it was just a few seconds earlier. And it was I thought, a pretty important story.
Sounds like a lot of parties I've been to.
Yeah. So then I started watching at parties and seeing how often that happens.
Right.
And so the opening monologue of Half-Life, the character talks about that and says that about 60% of the time the person they're talking to won't continue the conversation, won't ask for the story to be continued.
If interrupted.
Yeah, and so that monologue sets up that structure of the play. A lot of the scenes in the play end, they're interrupted, actions constantly interrupted, characters disappear or forgotten, because that felt like the experience in the home. So I think I learned from writers like Beckett and Chekhov how to take the things I was hearing in everyday life, the richness of that, experience and then frame it or give it a structure. And that partially also came from my mathematical training, that always looking for that structure.
Structure. That's a fabulous example. So I want to ask a question about the Little Years, which was at Tarragon last season, is that right? And Stratford prior to
Yeah,
that?
it was an older play that was, Stratford commissioned me to rewrite that play.
Oh, right. So I'm going to quote you to you. I warned you I would do this. So in the program notes, which if you saw it, I loved your thoughts in the program notes, and I was fantasizing about the opportunity to ask you this question from a year ago. So, haha, here I am now. So you said this at first. That's right. You better not have just made this up, because now I'm holding you accountable. I wrote The Little Years because I wanted to explore, through the characters of the play, the way a person's beliefs about time, talent, and the value of art play out in their daily lives. Fine, that was acceptable. Then you went on to say, new and almost paradoxical ways of thinking about time and space have emerged in contemporary mathematics and physics. One day, we may be forced to re-examine our unconscious beliefs about art because of these ideas. What does this mean? I've been waiting a year to ask you this question.
I was hoping you wouldn't ask me that. So, well, you know, I think artists are really insecure. Playwrights are, in particular, are very insecure because if you imagine a playwright from the 30s who was very popular at the time and moved thousands of people, but their work is forgotten, we tend to think of them as failures.
Right.
And that idea that the value of a work of art is tied to how long it lasts really started to become pressing for artists around the time of Newton, when this idea of time that went on forever, every moment indistinguishable from the last, and just went on forever and ever. Before that, people thought time was circular. They often created works of art anonymously. I mean, there was a huge commodification of time, and artists began to think that their value depended on how long their work lasted. And, I think, so I've been always really kind of depressed by that, because you have no control over the fate of your work, and your work might be completely valueless if it doesn't last. That's the kind of thing we all feel very deeply, or if it isn't seen by enough people. So I got some relief when I started thinking about these new ideas about time. So for instance, with relativity, if you had, this is something a character mentions in the play, but if you had a painting and it was put on a rocket ship and sent away from Earth, and people continued to write about it for thousands of years in Earth time, but it only lasted 2 years in rocket ship time, how long has the painting actually existed? With different frames of reference, time flows at a different rate. There's no meaning of absolute time, so it becomes hard to even date things, which calls into the question, is time really conferring value on this thing when there's no absolute standard of time? And then there's even worse paradoxes, which I really can't get into, but I'll just tell you. There's a German mathematician called Cantor who went mad eventually, because maybe partially because he discovered that there are different kinds of infinity. So if you have a set, I've got 5 fingers and 5 fingers.
Trouble with the one kind of infinity.
Yes, most people do. One kind of infinity is pretty much enough, but there's infinitely many infinities, it turns out. So, if you match your fingers on 2 hands, I know there's the same number of fingers on both hands because I can pair them up. So he said that's how we should compare the size of infinite sets. And then he actually proved that there are some infinite sets you can't pair up with others, that they're actually bigger in a well-defined sense. So the other most mind-boggling discovery in the sort of breakthrough in the 20th century was quantum mechanics. And in quantum mechanics, some people think that when we make measurements, the universe actually splits into different versions of itself. And these aren't quacks. These are people who developed a whole branch of computing that will have a huge impact on us one day, called quantum computing. They're actually building computers based on very strange properties of electrons. So the people who think that there might be multiple universes aren't aren't quacks. And so I just figured that you can show very easily if the universe branched in 2 every second, that interval, that universe that's branching, has a bigger order of infinity than straightforward Newtonian time, where you just have a linear series of instants. So if you're an artist, you'd really prefer to live in the branching universe, because you'd have a much higher order of immortality.
And because
you'd have
the
infinitely
people in
more.
that other universe saw my play for years. It was packed every night.
Yeah, so there's a mathematical sense, and a very well-defined mathematical sense in which you'd have more immortality in that branching universe, even though they're both infinite. So I wrote a philosophy paper on this, just to kind of relieve myself from this idea that we know what time is and that we know what immortality is and so on. And I think we've moved away from a sense of time that maybe some ancient cultures had, or immortality, that what matters is the immortality of your family or your culture or your friends or the people who surround you through your reputation. And that's what I tried to capture in the little years, was that maybe there's another kind of way our work persists or affects people that's much smaller, but maybe more valuable in a way, just through the people you touch in your lives. There's a great American philosopher, Thomas Nagel, who wrote a book called Mortal Questions, which is a beautiful series of essays, and he said in it that the things that happen to a person can extend beyond the boundaries of their body and even beyond the boundaries of their life. So our lives can be affected by what people say about us, by what our children do, things like that. We're kind of corporate entities that live well beyond ourselves, and I wanted to try and capture that feeling too in the little years. So that's why there's a character in the play you never see. You just get a portrait of their life from what people say about them. And then you see a character whose life is deeply affected by a woman who's growing up in the 50s, who's discouraged from going into the arts and sciences, whose life is deeply affected by what people say about her. So, but who in the end has a deep impact on her niece, and probably much bigger impact than her famous brother had.
Yeah, I mean, culturally it's true. We're sort of impact obsessed, right? It's the the age of measurement in some ways. And I was thinking about your idea of, there are writers in the field of theater and education who talk about a theater of little changes. And I think it's a similar kind of counter-narrative to this idea that art has to solve all the problems and have enormous impact and make these great changes, otherwise it has no value. Right.
And I think that obsession with impact comes from, this comes full circle back to education. Because I remember once teaching a grade 3 class in Parkdale about fractions, and I taught them for about 5 weeks, and taught them stuff that grade 7 kids would struggle with. And at the end of that time, they all wrote this test that would have, about a grade 7 level, and they all sat there, including kids who couldn't formally sit still, and wrote this, and they all got over 90 on it. And the most exciting thing is the kids who missed it begged to write the test, because they knew it wouldn't be a punishment or a ranking, which is the two things we use tests for, or a threat or a ranking, because they knew it was a chance to show off, and they felt safe and secure, and they would do well. And the atmosphere in that class was really magical. The kids were no longer competing against themselves, they were competing against the problem. They were solving the problem for the thrill of surmounting a series of challenges, and also for the sheer beauty of seeing a pattern or seeing a connection. I mean, I even broke up a fight once by telling a bully to apologize to the other kid, or I wouldn't give him his bonus question. And he apologized to get the bonus question. So that's the kind of sense of joy kids have at succeeding and exploring these deep things. And imagine what society would look like if, instead of constantly competing for scraps of praise or success, they constantly had the experience of discovering new things, exercising their imaginations, roaming the universe with their minds. If they had that experience all the way through without that kind of unhealthy competition, then I think we would have a different approach to art. People would create art because it's a spiritual experience, a way of communing with the beauty of the universe, I think. They would, of course, care about what other people thought, but in a much healthier way.
Right. Can I ask you, in the JUMP program, have you seen any results that would contest the also persistent idea that girls are disengaged from math and science and technology?
Oh yeah, we did. We participated in a randomized controlled study, so that's like a gold standard in experimental design that was done by cognitive scientists at the Hospital for Sick Children, and oddly, girls are doing better now in elementary math than boys, so it's shifted. It doesn't persist necessarily, but in this particular board, though, girls were doing worse than boys, and by the end of the study, they were doing the same, so everything had been equalized. And we've seen that over and over again, that there's not any difference between the sexes, and there's not as great a difference between the low and high students as we expect. There should be.
Right.
So, I think one of the sad things is that there's two things. I've heard that there's research that girls actually, if a boy's getting a C+ in math, he thinks he's just doing great. If a girl's getting an A-, she thinks she's doing badly. So that's one of the problems, why they get discouraged. And I think there's a big socialization effect. I think that, you know, a lot of people think, okay, if you try and teach kids equally or narrow the bell curve, you're going to hold the faster kids back. Well, in every study we've done, we've seen the faster kids do better than in the treatment group. So you're not holding anyone back. The kids are actually going faster and further because everyone's moving together. But the other effect nobody would really expect is that the faster kids also benefit because the whole class loves math. They're not standing out like a sore thumb anymore. Everyone is engaging in that, and I think girls would benefit more from that than boys. The collective and the group. That's what I think. It might be wrong, but
why do you think that?
Well, I just think girls care. From my experience, my daughter, her friends, everyone, I've seen that they care more about the collective. But I might be wrong. This is a really, I have no idea if that's true, but that's just my sense. But certainly everyone would benefit more from. They'd benefit in another way. There's a great psychologist, Carol Dweck, who wrote a book called Mindset, and she found people tend to have either a growth mindset where they believe that their success depends on hard work, perseverance, getting good teaching. Other people have a fixed mindset where they believe that their success depends on having a natural gift for something or a talent. She did a study with grade 6 kids where they were academically identical, the group, and but 2 years later their marks had diverged by about 15 percentage points. The kids with a fixed mindset had started to do worse and worse because even though those kids were doing well, they thought they had a gift, and so they didn't tend to work because they didn't want, that would show they didn't have the gift. And I was like that when I was younger too. They didn't tend to work, and they also gave up easily when they encountered a difficulty because they thought it proved they didn't have the growth mindset. So, you know, I've been in some private schools where parents have been quite outraged at the idea that, you know, if you're going to try and reduce the differences between kids, you're going to hold someone back, my child back. But that actually might be damaging the child in some way, this idea that they're the gifted one or they're the smart one, because in the end they may encounter difficulties because they haven't been taught to persevere. They haven't been taught how the brain works, that it's perseverance that matters much more than the gift. And they also haven't experienced the collective joy of succeeding together. When I first started going into inner city schools and volunteering, I realized that there's no advantage to putting kids together in a group of 30 if you're trying to teach them except that they're an audience. So as a playwright, I thought of them as an audience and tried to do a performance that everyone could participate in, which meant finding out what everyone knew, working in smaller steps so everyone could come along, having little twists and turns in the lesson, having occasional bonus questions to get kids more excited, and making sure that I minimize the hierarchies in the class so everyone could focus and listen as an audience. And then you get an incredible audience effect. I mean, I've seen in Brixton, I was in this inner city school, it was the most violent school I've ever been in my life. I saw kids removed from the playground at lunch. They would form rings around each other. The monitors couldn't even control it. It looked like something out of Lord of the Flies. Really, I mean, it was really violent. And they put 30 behavioral kids into one class for me. So I walked in there, and I told them, you know, when I was young, I thought I was dumb, and I made them promise that if I didn't explain something in a way they understood, they'd stop me. And then I taught them about binary codes, how computers read codes and zeros and ones, and the kids went nuts. They thought they were little code breakers. They wanted longer and longer codes. And then you can do a mind reading trick that's connected to the binary code. And when the kids figured that out, they wanted to come up and do it. And on the third lesson like that, when we came in, the kids cheered. They were just so excited to be doing all this hard-looking math. So, you know, the audience effect is just spectacular when you get a group of kids who are both experiencing the joy of success and feeling that they can all do it together.
Yeah, there's some connection here about playing the role of the successful math student as well as experiencing success.
That's right.
Which is intimately connected, I think.
Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
No. Well, I think you can teach any subject that way, too. I thought when we started JUMP that we'd have a theater program by now or a writing program, but it's almost killed me just getting the math going.
Right.
But you could...
That was my next question.
You could teach anything the same way.
Right. So, okay, I did have a question because I read the article that Barry referenced in Scientific American Mind. And you talked about it as guided discovery learning, which is really interesting. And you are quite specific and clear about the idea of scaffolding, building from small steps. These are not new ideas to teaching, but you very clearly say these manageable steps are crucial, that immediate feedback is crucial, and that lots of practice is key. So these aren't revolutionary ideas, but as a formula, this is a methodology that you use. And so I started to think about theater education and wondered about the possible connection between the two, because the premise that you set in the article is that many children are suffering from math anxiety. And I started to think about performance anxiety or being on a stage or different kinds of anxieties that students often feel in school in different subjects, in different areas. So what kinds of connections, if you're thinking about theater education alongside math education, do you think there are different ways to engage and to allay those kinds of anxieties and to rehearse the role of success that you talk about so much in the JUMP math program?
Yeah, that's a really hard question because I have more experience with poetry. So I once taught kids, these are high school kids, so I told them what a metaphor was and a simile. I gave them a few examples, and then I wrote things on the board like the sea is like or the tree is. And I gave them all books of poetry and asked them to open them at random and just pick a phrase that they thought could complete that sentence. And they did that for a whole page, and then I asked them to put the metaphors and similes they liked together, and where they felt there was a gap, write some lines in between. And they produced really beautiful poems. I quoted a bunch of them in my book, The End of Ignorance. They were so stunning. That took just an hour, and the kids said that they felt much better than staring at a blank page, that they had some kind of structure. So I think if I was going to try and do the same thing in theater, that's what I would look for, is to give them an instruction in something they'd need to do, fairly rigorous instruction, and then have them complete something I'd given them just with a word or phrase or an action or something, small steps like that. But I haven't thought, because I'm not a director, I don't think, I haven't thought about that very deeply. I know Daniel Brooks has done some phenomenal work with kids using that kind of technique of drawing on what they could do in small steps, but I haven't thought about it deeply enough.
And what would immediate feedback look like in that context? Because I asked you this before the evening began. That I'm picturing the teacher with the 36 children in front of her, trying to give immediate feedback on an individual basis, with the demands that exacts on his or her attentiveness and time and capacity. So how do you scaffold so that all of those children individually feel like they're receiving the immediate feedback that you say is so central?
It's a great question, because in math, I think math is actually the easiest subject to do it in, because, I remember I once taught these kids this lesson on perimeter, and I'd have them draw simple shapes, and at the beginning of the lesson, the kids couldn't even find the perimeter of a simple L shape because they'd missed sides. But by the end, they were doing some hard grade 7 shapes from a grade 7 book, and they all had their hands up just because I'd gone in those steps. And You know, a bonus question would be something like if you've got a little L shape like that and you add a square to it, the perimeter is going to go up, but there's one place you can put a square where the perimeter stays the same. And so you can create a series of simple questions like that are puzzles that the kids get more and more excited by. And you don't have to mark everyone's work because you're going in such small steps, you only have to keep your eye usually on a few students who might need a bit of extra help. The same thing with that creative writing exercise. Because it was very well structured, the kids only had to complete those sentences and then do some work. I found it very easy to just walk around and give them some help and some suggestions. I don't know, and because theater is such an active thing, and I'm not a director, I don't, and I've never really investigated all the games actors play in those things. I don't know those things. I'm not sure what that would look like in theater. It's a really good question.
Well, you say something else which I think is important, and I read it in your article, the idea of appreciating, relishing even, puzzles. And I was reading about another study that some academics here at U of T did at Sick Kids Hospital, looking at the beautiful atrium and the incredible architecture and the way that they've reimagined that space. And they were actually talking to the children about that space. And what came out of that study was very fascinating, because most of, if you've seen it, you'll know that there's lots of Disney characters and it's a very animated space. But most of the children they spoke with didn't appreciate the art in that space because they said it didn't provide any puzzles. There was nothing for them to figure out. Right. It was rather an adult's idea of what would be an animated space for a child. But what they actually craved was work art that would engage them and make them ask questions.
Yeah,
and
so
that's not what it did.
That's a good suggestion. I mean, I think if I was doing a writing exercise in theater, I would take a fragment of dialogue, either two lines that a line was missing between them. You have to fill in a line between these two, or you have to complete a sequence of lines with some objective. The character wants something. And then maybe build that into improvisation, teach kids that they could actually take that into an improv once they've learned some basic techniques. I think that's how it would start. But it's a good question.
Good, we'll talk. We'll design this program.
Yeah, that would be good.
But I want to ask you a philosophical question, because you have lectured in philosophy as well. And I was interested in your sense of the place of conceptual versus applied knowledge in math, in the arts, and in life, for that matter. And my thinking about this is that there's a lot of instrumentalism in education now. There's a lot of celebration of the applied nature of things. Right. And I sometimes think that our thinking and our learning about big concepts and ideas and conceptual thinking about art or life falls to the wayside in this kind of educational context. That's
another great question, very complex, and I think there are a lot of false dichotomies around concepts and applications and so on. So and I'll talk about two maybe, one in the arts and one in the sciences. One of the reasons I think kids have struggled so much in mathematics is because in the 90s, we keep mistaking the ends of education for the means to get kids there. So we want kids to be creative, to be innovative, to use intuition, all these things. So we start with big, rich problems, highly conceptual. What does conceptual mean now in mathematics, or what does problem solving mean, or in any area? It means rich, complex, usually highly relevant or contextualized, something that kids would be interested in. That was a huge push in education, and it's a positive push because you don't want the kids just understanding things in a rote way. But there's also some potential negative side effects of that approach, because rich, complex, conceptual also means very complex usually, or more complex than most kids can handle. And so what cognitive scientists are finding now is that you build concepts. The end goal is concepts and conceptual learning, but you actually build them through smaller challenges. So, for instance, they found that chess players don't learn the game. They don't learn to play chess well just by playing chess. They play mini games with 1 or 2 pieces over and over again until they figure out that position. They memorize positions. They study moves of master players. None of those things look very creative, or like they're going to produce a genius. But actually, those are the things that produce genius and creativity. So the end looks very different from the means to get someone there, and that we make that mistake over and over again. We even make it in really innocuous-looking ways. Like, unfortunately, in education, people began to call practice drill and kill. And there's a famous cognitive scientist, Herb Simon, who said that's one of the worst ideas in education, because all the research on how kids become good at things show they need a lot of practice. He said the challenge in education is how you make practice interesting. And we found in JUMP that if you just raise the bar incrementally and have a well-scaffolded lesson, kids will practice forever. They love reaching higher and higher levels. So you can make practice interesting, but it's gotten to the point where kids were even discouraged from learning their times tables, because that was just a rote drill that would discourage them. Well, now cognitive scientists are finding that we have very poor working memories, and if you haven't committed the basic facts to long-term memory, then your working memory is constantly overwhelmed trying to remember those facts. And you can't actually solve problems or reach a high conceptual level. So out of these things that look very mechanical or rote, they're actually fundamental to high-level conceptual thinking. There's a false dichotomy there. Also, a kid who doesn't know their times tables is never going to see a pattern or make a prediction or an estimate. Every day is a new day. So they're never going to generalize or think conceptually.
Right.
And it's the same in the arts with basic skills and things, basic training and skills. That true talent doesn't come, well, for a few people it seems to emerge out of nowhere, but the vast majority of people get there through practice and building up incrementally. And I think, so the other dichotomy in the arts is this idea that, you either have a deeply emotional or engaging piece of work or an intellectual piece of work, and or a conceptual piece of work. And T.S. Eliot said once that Shakespeare and the metaphysical poets managed to make people feel what it was to have a thought.
Right.
That those things weren't separated. And that's, I think, should be a goal of theater, because there's no other place where you can make people feel what it is to have a thought so viscerally than on stage.
Wonderful. That's a perfect segue for my last question before we invite the audience to ask some questions. So in the interests of the upcoming book that Barry has shared with you, Why Theatre Now? On the Virtue and Value of Canadian Theatre in the New Millennium, I want to ask you, why theatre now? And, for that matter, why math now?
So I'll quote one more philosopher, Richard Rorty, who said that, great literature, he may also have been talking about philosophy, makes us feel what it is to be another person. And I think that's something that's really essential in this age when we have such divisive politics. So many issues we can't solve because we lack empathy or an understanding of the other side. That I think that's really a role for theater now, to make people understand the multiple perspectives on an issue and understand the importance of issues viscerally. So to give one of the nominees for the Seminovich Award, Chris Abraham, who I was lucky enough to work with, created a play called Seeds about genetic engineering, which was incredibly powerful but incredibly complex and opened my eyes to all kinds of issues. Daniel Brooks has done similar work, his latest play, Civility, about city politics. People need to see those things. My partner, Pamela Sinha, has written a play about partially about post-traumatic stress that's running now and has had a profound effect on audiences. There's no better area for helping people understand those issues and begin to understand multiple perspectives on those issues. And in mathematics, there's a simple answer. Well, everybody understands the economic loss. There's a huge economic loss from having a population that's not fully numerate. But there are those deeper losses I talked about, an inability to connect with the natural world on a deep level or understand the consequences of our actions, an inability to see the profound beauty of the world that keeps mathematicians working on these puzzles and problems endlessly, because it's just so satisfying. And also, surprisingly, for children, there's new research that shows that math is a much better predictor of long-term success for elementary school students than reading even. It's the number one predictor of long-term success. Math becomes a gateway for so many people, particularly disadvantaged students. And so it's extraordinary. It's a matter of equity. It's extremely important that we start to eliminate these hierarchies and allow all students to succeed in math, regardless of what adults think about math, that it's got to be boring or it's not that important. You know, I believe kids have a right to develop all of their potential in every subject, and that we won't really have a fully realized society until we do that.
Thank you. Are there questions? Reactions to what you've heard?
Feel free to ask challenging questions.
I just wanted to make a point, actually answering partly your question about why theater now. Well, thanks very much. And I guess one of the things I also see in the unity about the arts, and particularly theater and science, is really the bottom line in those fields is a search for the truth. And that's something I see in current society that is so missing from every aspect of our society, not just through politics. Actually, even in academic life, in education, the truth gets obscured. It gets obscured for many reasons, political correctness, which has really seeped through our society. I wonder if you could just comment on that, because to me, that's why we need theater so badly. It really illuminates the truth that we sort of are missing around us.
Yeah, that's. I hadn't really thought of that. That's a great question. In my list of things, I think there's a growing and frightening disregard for scientific evidence. I mean, science isn't certain, and one of the stupid arguments is, oh, you're not certain global warming's happening, so why should we do anything about it? I mean, but the people who say that would never, first of all, they'd never buy a car from someone who wasn't an expert in that, or who wasn't manufactured by experts in the area. And if 99% of the engineers on Earth said that car's brakes are likely to fail, almost certain to fail, you wouldn't buy it or get into it with your kids. So why would we do the same thing with global warming? Like, it's just insane disregard, and our politicians get away with that. So it's very important to reestablish a respect for truth, even if it's not certain. You know, there's no such thing as certainty. In theater, truth is much more difficult, and I think you know, and plays that appear to be profound and discover truths can look dated 10 years later. So it's a harder, truth is harder to gauge in theater, but I think that theater sparks debates about the truth and does quite often help people progress or see new truths. I was profoundly affected by Rorty's statement that you know, art can help you experience what it means, what it feels to be someone else. Because I think theater, and particularly film, have done more to create tolerance and open up discussion in the world than almost any other media. So that's a very good point, that they're essential for some kind of exploration of the truth.
Mm-hmm. Yes, in the front here.
Just come to the center here.
Hi, John.
Hi.
I'm a writer and an actor as well at University of Toronto, and I was really inspired by Possible Worlds, just because I also am currently writing a piece that incorporates both future timelines and present timelines and traveling back to change it for the future and things like that. What are some of the challenges you came across with that script of yours, but also trying to create the lines between like the scientific aspect of it as well as the creative, and trying to make sure that it all works, but it still benefits, you know, like the drama aspect of it. And I guess that's kind of what I'm working on, and trying to make it sound real, but also have that level of like creativity and stimulation, things like that.
Yeah, I think, I mean, I have no idea if the play works. It's had some productions that are dismal failures, including the ones that were called Muddled Mess, and hopelessly muddled. So it's a very difficult play, and it's very difficult to write in that genre. It's a person, for people who don't know the play, it's a person who thinks he lives in multiple worlds and is sort of moves back and forth between them. My only suggestions would be, I tried to make each scene or each world feel real or live from my own experience, rather than being some kind of abstract, some kind of abstract essay on this thing. I tried to build it out of real experiences, and the center of the play is a love story. So the other thing is it went through multiple incarnations. I mean, even after that first production, I did some rewriting, and you need to find actors or a community of people who can help you shape it. So Daniel Brooks's production of the play was one of the most exciting things I've ever experienced as an artist. He did it in the backspace of Passmarais, which is a tiny little space, and it was a kind of gray box. But he and Richard Farron and Andrea Lundy created whole worlds out of just lighting cues, sound cues. The first scene, there's a dead body, and there's these detectives, and he had a curtain that rose slowly, and he had one light, one kind of bare light bulb hanging above them, and he just started swinging it. And so it just went back and forth, and the whole scene you felt kind of nauseated or off kilter because of the light going back and forth. So he really elevated the play, I think. And he had great notes about things that, if he tried to make something work and couldn't, he's not a pushy director who tells you to rewrite things just because he doesn't like them. He would try things and see if he could make them work, and if he couldn't make them work, then I would take it very seriously. So, and he inspired some very good rewrites for the play. So if you can find a community who can help you get it on its feet and see if it's working, that's my advice.
Mm-hmm. Are there any other questions?
Hello.
The well-known story of Ibsen hanging on his wall, the portrait of Stringer, Ibsen, the paragon of rationality, and Stringer, the embodiment of madness. Do you imagine yourself in one of those positions, and if so, who sits or hangs across from you?
I'd like to be more like Stringer. I don't think there's a lot of madness in my work. I've always admired writers who seem to be able to draw on deep wells of their subconscious, who have things poured out of them, and who write on an emotional level that's profoundly deep. I've always admired that, and it's something that's never come natural to me. So I'd like to be more in that camp. I'll do the best I can. I think the things I can see, I believe that, and I don't structure. It's not the kind of spontaneity or natural writing that I'd love to be able to do.
Basically, finding it a little difficult to comprehend how you can combine two very opposite Hofstadter and Godel Ashter Bach, where he combines music, mathematics, and art, and it's a very these are at the top of the at the edge of new ideas and everything. Do you ever find that you go beyond most people's comprehension of what you're trying to explain?
I hope not, because there's a character in my new play who says everything is either simple or paradoxical, and I believe that deeply. That in math, for instance, people would be surprised to know that you could explain calculus in a way that everyone would understand. I was at the Calgary Teachers Convention a while ago, and I asked teachers why, if you have the number 7, and you divide it by 2/3, how come you can flip and multiply? Like that's the same as 7 times 3/2. And someone yelled out, because you get the right answer. So that's the level most people know that at. And so I usually will invite a teacher who's math phobic to come up, and I just ask them 5 minutes of questions, and at the end of that time, they know why it works. It's absolutely trivial. You can show kids with a chocolate bar why it works. But the vast majority of people, including people who are teaching it, don't have a clue why it works, because we've accepted this idea that math is inherently difficult or beyond us. But it's absolutely simple, and if we actually took the time, we could teach calculus that way. We've got to get away as a society from this idea that there are people who hold sacred knowledge or have these abilities or whatever. It's nonsense. Everything is fundamentally simple in math. In fact, it should be the easiest subject, because logicians proved 100 years ago that you can reduce everything in math to steps a robot could understand. How come it's such a mystery? Why are we keeping that knowledge from everybody? And the arts are a little harder. It's harder to develop, I think, skills there and talents, but I think you can nurture those abilities also. So I would hope that anything I do would be explicable to anybody. The only thing people can understand is when we begin to enter this realm of the paradoxical. Even at the foundations of mathematics, there are deep paradoxes about infinity, about things like that, about what we can prove and can't prove, about what we can understand and not understand, that are there's a borderline where our intellect starts to break down. But it's not like there are some people who can cross that line. Nobody can cross it, because it's a line of true mystery. And it's where the universe starts to outstrip our imaginations. That's a fascinating borderline. But it's not because there aren't some people who can go beyond it, unless they're mystics, which there may be, but their minds don't work in the way mine does.
Oh, jeez. Oh, sorry. I don't know what basically, yeah. When you try and explain stuff, like it's like, have you ever read any of Northrop Frye's, where he says that you have to paint a picture with words? And basically, using words for a mathematician or a physicist is like, I guess, going out of their area of comfort.
Well,
and and like basically this. I was talking to this physicist who gave a talk on quantum computing, and I was complimenting him, but basically I said to him, only physicists can understand, what you're trying to convey, but like, I don't know if you ever heard of Bill Cosby, but before he was into television, he used to be a stand-up comic, and he did this routine on Noah called Right, where he more or less...
yeah, I had that album
yeah,
when I was a kid.
And basically, he explains binary pairs, and he goes through it all, and he ends up at the end where I guess God asked him, "Now, do you have any questions?" And he says, "Yeah, what's a qubit?" And that basically leads into quantum computing.
Yeah, so I think that the only reason mathematicians have trouble explaining themselves is because it's a language that's been built up over centuries. It's each step, each part of the language is simple, but you can't usually talk to a lay audience because there's too many things you need to know. It's like trying to learn French without knowing anything. But it's still fundamentally simple. And I think my favorite writers write in the same way. In philosophy, Wittgenstein, he wrote a book called Philosophical Investigations. There are a series of aphorisms, and they're all, he's like a Hemingway of philosophy. They're all beautifully written, very simple, but the challenge is to figure out why he's saying them and why these particular aphorisms are sitting next to each other. He said he didn't he wrote that way because he didn't want to save people the trouble of thinking, and also because he found it hard to systematize his thought and write long, coherent paragraphs. But it's fun that even before I understood his philosophy, I read it over and over again because it was so beautiful, the simplicity of the language, the images. And I think people like Chekhov, Beckett, they're always extraordinarily easy to understand, but profoundly deep because of the kind of depths that open up under that simplicity. So I think we
Yeah, there's one last question, and then
Okay.
we'll head out to the
Thank you.
lobby for a nice reception.
Thanks, John and Kathleen, for your enriching dialogue tonight. I had one last question. I was wondering more specifically, John, if you could say something about what got you started again, besides the prize itself and besides David's rendition of your poem, but in those moments when you were first working with maybe writer's block. I wonder how that might be even linked to like math phobia, taking the first steps of actually adding up 1 + 1, or who knows what it is. But what was it like for you in those moments to actually start again?
I mean, the Simonovich Prize, as I said, was a huge impact and had a huge impact, and also the winner of the first Simonovich Prize, Daniel Brooks. I worked with him on Possible Worlds and also Half-Life, and I really believe he elevated those plays. He's an absolutely brilliant director. So I wanted to work with him again, and that was a huge motivation. And then with, I think it's a bit hard to overcome writer's block unless you really dedicate yourself to it. Because math has taken over my life to such an extent. The latest play I wrote, which is called Risk, which is about doctors in the 1800s, there was an epidemic of deaths among women in childbirth because doctors weren't washing their hands. And it was a kind of cyclical problem because the more women died, the more the doctors would dissect their corpses and then go and infect other women. So what they thought was a cure was actually causing more and more problems. And that seemed like a great metaphor for me for some of these invisible problems that we're struggling with. But I wrote a draft of that, and we reread it with Daniel, but it was a bit of a mess. I'm not satisfied with the play because I think as a writer you need to constantly be thinking, listening, reading, writing things down, or your subconscious doesn't really kick in. So I'm trying to find space to write because I need to really focus on that. I think that's one way to overcome that kind of block. The other way is to work, as I said, to find a community of people who can help you. So I learned a lot from that reading, and it sort of set me on a new path with the play.
Thank you so
Thank you.
much, John. Thank you, everyone, for your questions. Please join us in the